a certain kind of set of operations, and it will proceed from there. What is terrifying to watch in the coverage of this is, of course, that when these buildings collapse, there probably are emergency people right underneath those buildings, and so I imagine that large numbers of casualties will have been amongst the emergency services themselves, who were fighting the fires, who were probably trying to get in there to get wounded people out, and so it could have devastated that whole sector. But New York will then bring to bear other emergency teams from other parts of Manhattan and Bronx, Queens, and so on and so forth. So these plans are regularly practiced and developed, and so it's not as if they're going to be completely overwhelmed. They will be overwhelmed, but they've nevertheless got ways of tackling it, and that is encouraging. But we don't know yet how well that has worked.
I suppose that the biggest concern really is that without intelligence, military or state intelligence, these incidents can happen. If they can't be prevented, there's very little the planners can do except practice their response, and get that as smooth as possible.
Yes, that's right. I think that, we talk in disaster planning of different phases of actions. One, the main focus increasingly is on preventive action to try and reduce risks. But of course, you have to be pragmatic and you have to plan for whatever eventualities are sensible to plan for. Whether you devote huge resources to planning for something which happens as rarely as this, I don't know. Those are difficult decisions. Trying to decide on how far to develop plans, which of course are very costly to develop and very costly to practice and train and so on and so forth, and they might require very specialized equipment. How far to devote massive injection of money for that is difficult to know. I imagine there'll be a big reaction, and I imagine that emergency management will change globally as a result of this event, and that will be and that probably will be much sooner than later.
And I was speaking a little earlier there with Professor Ian Davis, specialist in disaster management training at the Cranfield Disaster Management Centre here in Britain. It's now coming up to 6:30 in the evening on the US East Coast. And of course the rescue efforts there around the World Trade Center and around the Pentagon building in Washington are only just beginning. You're listening to a BBC News special here on the BBC World Service with Fergus Nichol and Julian Marshall. In a series of catastrophic attacks on the heart of American power in New York and Washington, 2 hijacked passenger jets were flown directly into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York, one of the world's tallest buildings and symbol of American capitalism during morning rush hour. The towers caught fire and collapsed. Shortly afterwards, another hijacked airliner was flown into the Pentagon building in Washington, the headquarters of the American military. The building burst into flames and part of its 5-sided structure collapsed. This is a special BBC News programme on the BBC World Service. We're breaking our normal schedules to bring you the latest news from the United States following the series of attacks in Washington and New York. We'll be running programmes over the next several hours with updates from correspondents on the East Coast and across the world. We'll have regular updates about the effects of those attacks during this time, with full news bulletins at the top and bottom of every hour. Indeed, we'll have one summary for you very briefly. BBC World Service, this is a news special with Fergus Nichol and Julian Marshall. The United States is reeling from 2 terrorist attacks on New York's World Trade Center and the Pentagon outside Washington. There was catastrophic destruction and massive loss of life as both towers of the World Trade Center collapsed. They, like the Pentagon, have been deliberately hit by hijacked commercial airlines. Analysis coming up in a moment, but first, the news with Jackie Candler.
There's been a series of catastrophic attacks in the heart of American power in New York and Washington. 2 hijacked passenger jets were flown directly into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York, one of the world's tallest buildings and symbol of American capitalism during morning rush hour. The towers caught fire and collapsed. Shortly afterwards, another hijacked airliner was flown into the Pentagon building in Washington, the headquarters of the American military. The building burst into flames and part of its 5-sided structure collapsed and continues to burn. Another building near the World Trade Center, the 47-story Salomon Brothers building, has since also collapsed after catching fire. A 4th airliner crashed in Pennsylvania. A huge rescue operation is underway, and there's clearly been heavy loss of life. Many thousands of people were in the Trade Center, and the governor of New York State, George Pataki, has said the casualties will be more than any of us can bear. It's already known that some 260 people were on board the planes. President Bush has consulted his national security advisors and is to make a national address. American forces around the world have been placed on the highest state of security alert, and warships are taking up stations along the east coast of the United States. Many of the militant groups that might come under suspicion for the attacks denied carrying them out. The Taliban authorities in Afghanistan said the Saudi militant Osama bin Laden, who's wanted by the United States for alleged previous attacks on American targets, did not have the capability for such an operation. The Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat said he was completely shocked. In Moscow, President Vladimir Putin condemned what he called inhuman attacks, and the British Prime Minister Tony Blair spoke of a battle between the democratic world and terrorism. BBC News.
You're listening to a BBC News special on the attack on the World Trade Center in New York and the American Defense Headquarters, the Pentagon, near Washington. Well, let's pick up right away with our correspondent Greg Barrow, who is in New York City. He's been monitoring the traumatic and tragic events of the last several hours. Greg, it's now early evening, I guess, in New York. Tell us the situation in southern Manhattan.
Yes, Fergus, night is falling on this momentous day here, and the streets are now looking fairly deserted, which is a very unusual scene in New York. Normally, those streets, particularly places like Times Square, crowded with tourists and revelers, people rushing home from work, they're now empty. I think a sign of the fear people are feeling and the shock and grief they're also feeling about the events that took place early this morning here. The whole area on the southern tip of the island around the World Trade Center is still sealed off, and rescue work is being hampered there because of falling masonry in buildings adjacent to what was the World Trade Center. The World Trade Center buildings, of course, destroyed earlier today when two planes flew into them, and subsequently those two towers, some of the tallest towers in the world, collapsed. In the past couple of hours, a 47-story building close to what was the World Trade Center has fallen down, and I think one can assume that there's severe damage to much of the foundations of many other tall buildings in that area, simply because of the sheer weight and impact of that masonry falling to the ground.
What have the city administration, either the mayor, Mr. Giuliani, or the governor, Mr. Pataki, said about the rescue effort so far, Greg? I mean, I assume they'll be pushing on into the night, setting up lights, setting up what they need to get this desperately needed rescue effort, fully underway, despite the risks you've already outlined.
Yes, well, not just into the night, Fergus, but also into Wednesday. We had another news conference from Mayor Giuliani just a few moments ago, and he said that the whole of Manhattan from 14th Street down to the tip of the island would be sealed off for the whole of tomorrow. He called on all people who didn't have to come into New York to stay at home, to take a day off work. He said, treat it like a snow day. A snow day, of course, one of these days in New York's winters when the city is clogged up with heavy snowfall. And he said, treat it as a snow day and don't come in. He said that all schools will be closed. He said that traffic will be disrupted because of this rescue effort. And I think there's a feeling that he wants to keep as many people off the island as possible so that the rescue workers can carry on with their business unhindered.
We've been watching, Greg, quite extraordinarily vivid images, some fresh amateur video footage of the second airliner hitting the second tower of the World Trade Center before, as you described, the whole complex collapsed to the ground. This must have a profound effect on the very psyche of New Yorkers.
They can't believe it. I heard many people as I was walking through the streets this morning say it was like watching it on a movie. That's the phrase that came again and again. These are the kinds of scenes that people are used to going to the cinema to watch or seeing on television, but knowing that it's a horrible thing to watch, but thinking, well, it's not real, it's just special effects or it's some science fiction disaster. But to see two passenger planes crash into a landmark of New York City this morning, and within an hour, that signature of the Manhattan skyline collapse into the ground is something that none of them could have ever expected. And to realize that it wasn't a movie, then it was real life, is something that's going to take a long time for them to come to terms with.
Greg, many thanks. Greg Barrow, our correspondent in New York, and of course you can follow all the latest on the rescue efforts in New York and in Washington here on the BBC World Service. Well, within the past half hour, we've been getting reports that multiple explosions have rocked the capital of Afghanistan, Kabul. A big fire has apparently broken out, and flames are lighting up the night sky. Let's cross over now to Kabul and Jonathan Harley of ABC. Jonathan, what can you tell us?
We've seen several dramatic explosions on the horizon from the vantage point over the top of the city where I'm speaking to you from now. It seems to have been the result of artillery thrusting from the air, but it's not clear what the source of the attacks are.
Because certainly the word out of Washington is that these are not United States strikes in response to the attacks in Washington and New York.
Well, of course, there's a civil war which has been running for decades, or nearly a decade, here in Afghanistan, and opposition forces are only 50 kilometres or so to the north of here. In particular, what has developed this week of domestic importance is the suicide bomb attack on the key opposition leader Ahmed Shah Massoud, and his health is still, whether he's alive or not, is still open to some question. It is possible that these attacks are connected to that attack, that suicide bomb attack on him on Sunday, though of course it would be a remarkable coincidence.
So it is quite unusual, is it, that the anti-Taliban forces should go on the offensive against Kabul, if indeed that is the case?
Well, there hasn't been shelling on Kabul for a couple of years or so. So that, yes, certainly it would be a remarkable coincidence in that sense. It appears that one of the Taliban's ammunition dumps has been hit, and that's been the cause of these regular explosions into the night sky. It's about 3 o'clock in the morning now here, local time.
Jonathan Harley of ABC, many thanks for joining us from the Afghan capital, Kabul. Well, let's get more reaction from the United States now. Joining us on the line from Washington is Ivan Eland, Director of Defense Studies at the Cato Institute, a think tank there in Washington, D.C., which promotes public policy based on individual liberty and limited government. Mr. Eland, what's your reaction to these extraordinary and catastrophic events?
Well, I think my reaction is much like all Americans, horror at these despicable and diabolical acts, and really sympathy for the victims and their families at this time. It's a horrendous act, and I believe that the United States does need to retaliate, that we need to first investigate and find out for sure who did this, and then retaliate appropriately in the short term.
You say retaliate in the short term. How easy is that going to be to identify those responsible for perpetrating these atrocities? And isn't it really a time for, as the United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan said, a measured and calm response rather than quick vengeance?
Well, I think we do need to keep our heads about us, and I think the United States will do that. I think what we need to do is do a thorough investigation and make sure who did this, and I think we will find out who did this. Of course, we don't have to have proof that would be introduced into a court of law. I mean, it can be a lesser standard than that if we're sure that Osama bin Laden did it. I understand that U.S. intelligence officials are 90% sure that that's who did it, but I think we need to confirm that, and in the short term, we need to retaliate. But I don't think we should lose our heads. I think, the terrorists have already won 2 victories here. First of all, they've killed a lot of people, and they've hit a very 2 symbolic buildings, actually 3 symbolic buildings, Pentagon and then the 2 trade towers. And they've also the second thing they've done is they've caused a lot of fear in the American public, but I don't think we should give them a third victory, and that is to alter our political systems by clamping down on civil liberties in the name of security. We're the most open society in the world, and I'd like to keep it that way, and I don't want to give the terrorists yet another victory.
Very briefly, if you would, Mr. Eland, bring us up to date. It's now heading for 7 o'clock on the East Coast there. What's the situation in Washington? Briefly, if you would, sir.
Well, I just walked over to the BBC studio here, and there's not many people on the streets, and there's armored vehicles around some of the fire stations and streets blocked off. I think they're keeping the fire vehicles out in the streets so that no one could hit the fire station, and they're ready to go in case there's other emergencies. There's a lot of police presence. I understand they've blocked off some of the bridges with police checkpoints, and there's virtually nobody downtown during evening rush hour, which is just now getting over with.
Okay, thank you very much for those comments. That was Ivan Eland, Director of Defense Studies at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. You're listening to a BBC News special. There's been a series of coordinated attacks in the United States. Both New York and Washington have been hit, causing devastation and great loss of life. 2 airlines were deliberately crashed into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York, and both buildings collapsed. A third plane was then flown into the Pentagon Defense Headquarters in Washington. President Bush said those responsible would be hunted down and punished. Earlier, I was joined in the studio by Ali Mohsen Hamid, the Arab League's ambassador to London. I asked him what the position of the Arab League was. Were they with those Palestinians who were celebrating? Were they with Hamas, who said they didn't support the attacks but felt they were a result of America's oppression? Or were they with the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat in expressing their great sorrow?
We are with Yasser Arafat and with the Arab mainstream, who condemns and denounces this tragic accident and condemned. I mean, we are not supporting terrorism at all. It is wrong to point any finger to the Arabs that they are happy about what happened. If there is a minority, a very small minority, there is no linkage between, I mean, the majority of the Arabs and who are suffering from terrorism, in fact.
So the Arab League unreservedly condemns these attacks?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. The Arab League condemns this attack strongly.
President Bush has already said that he is determined to hunt down and punish those responsible.
I mean, President Bush, we should appreciate the situation in which he is facing now, but she should not be the judge to punish others. I mean, there is legal process and measures to hunt these people down through the legal process, not by military force or any other means.
But you don't feel that the scale of these attacks, the loss of life that is likely to have been incurred, which will obviously only become clear over the next few days, doesn't justify a punitive response by the United States?
Well, the Americans has had a negative experience before. I mean, they attacked Libya in 1986. I mean, there was no evidence after that Libya was involved in the Bill discotheque in Germany. So I think the Americans should be cautious about their reaction, and because the implications of that will not be conducive. So I think they should be quite cautious about their measures and to cooperate with others about that. I mean, but not to...
Because there have been calls by other states for a worldwide war on terrorism, a more coordinated strategies. That's something that the Arab League could support?
Excuse me, could you repeat your question?
There have been a number of calls from states around the world for a worldwide war on terrorism, a more coordinated strategy against terrorism. Is that something that the Arab League could support?
Yeah, the Arab League could support that. I mean, even in many issues before, the Arab League has declared that it is against terrorism. I mean, when Libya was accused of Lockerbie, I mean, we supported Libya, but we also declared in the meantime that we are against terrorism. In the Arab world, we are the victims of terrorism. I mean, we are suffering from terrorism I mean, Egypt suffered from that, Saudi Arabia suffered from that, Yemen suffered from that. I mean, we are not excluded from this evil.
That was Ali Muhsin Hamid, the Arab League's ambassador to London. Let's go over live now to Washington. We're getting remarks from the Pentagon itself, which was hit. I believe we're listening now to General Shelton.
Throughout our nation who lost loved ones. I think this is indeed a reminder of the tragedy and the tragic dangers that we face day in and day out, both here at home as well as abroad. I would tell you up front, I have no intentions of discussing today what comes next, but make no mistake about it, your armed forces are ready.
Mr. Chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Carl Levin.
Our intense focus on recovery and helping the injured and the families of those who were killed is matched only by our determination to prevent more attacks and matched only by our unity to track down, root out, and relentlessly pursue terrorists, states that support them, and harbor them. They are the common enemy of the civilized world. Our institutions are strong, and our unity is palpable.
Senator John Warner.
Thank you. As a past chairman preceding Carl Levin, I can assure you that the Congress stands behind our president, and the president speaks with one voice for this entire nation. This is indeed the most tragic hour in America's history. And yet I think it can be its finest hour, as our president and those with him, most notably our Secretary of Defense, our chairman, and the men and women of the armed forces all over this world stand ready not only to defend this nation and our allies against further attack, but to take such actions as are directed in the future in retaliation for this terrorist act. A series of terrorist acts unprecedented in world history. We call upon the entire world to step up and help, because terrorism is a common enemy to all, and we're in this together. The United States has borne the brunt, but who can be next? Step forward and let us hold accountable and punish those that have perpetrated this attack. Again, I commend the Secretary, the Chairman, and how proud we are. We spoke with our President here moments ago. He's got a firm grip on this situation, and the Secretary and the General have a firm grip on our armed forces and in communication of the world over.
Thank you very much.
And we were hearing there from Republican Senator John Warner. Donald Rumsfeld, Defense Secretary, now stepping back to the microphone to take some questions.
Any inkling at all, in any way, that something of this nature and something of this scope might be planned?
Charlie, we don't discuss intelligence matters.
I see. And how would you respond if you find out who did this?
Obviously, the President of the United States has spoken on that subject, and those are issues that he will address in good time.
Yes. Secretary, we are getting reports from CNN and others that there were bombs exploding in Kabul, Afghanistan. Are we at the moment striking back, and if so, is the target Osama bin Laden and his organization?
I've seen those reports. They, in no way is the United States government connected to those explosions.
What about Osama bin Laden? Do you suspect him as the prime suspect in this?
It's not the time for discussions like that.
Secretary, you said you could not be specific about casualties. Can you give us some characterization of whether it's dozens, hundreds in the building?
Well, we know there were large number, many dozens in the aircraft that flew at full power, steering directly into between, I think, the first and second floor of the, opposite the helipad. You've seen it. There cannot be any survivors. It just would be beyond comprehension. There are a number of people that they've not identified by name, but identified as being dead, and there are a number of casualties. But the FBI has secured the site, and the information takes time to come. People have been lifted out and taken away in ambulances, and the numbers will be calculated, and it will not be a few.
Could you tell us what you saw?
Mr. Secretary, do you consider what happened today, both in New York and here, an act of war?
There is no question but that the attack against the United States of America today was a vicious, well-coordinated, a massive attack against the United States of America. What words the lawyers will use to characterize it is for them.
Does that mean that the U.S. is at war then?
Mr. Secretary, you said that the Pentagon would be open for business tomorrow. What kind of assurances can you give the people who work here at the building that the building will be safe?
A terrorist can attack at any time, at any place, using any technique. It is physically impossible to defend at every time, in every place, against every technique. It is not possible to give guarantees. The people who work in this building do so voluntarily. They're brave people, and they do their jobs well.
Mr. Secretary, can you give a sense of what happened? What did you see when you left your office, ran down to the site, and kind of helped people on stretchers and returned to the command center?
I felt the shock of the airplane hitting the building, went through the building and then out into the area, and they were bringing bodies out that had been injured, most of which were alive and moving, but seriously injured. And a lot of volunteers were doing a terrific job helping to bring them out of the buildings and get them into stretchers and into ambulances and into airlifts.
Secretary, can you tell us how many of the dead were soldiers and how many were civilians? Have you been able to determine?
Absolutely not. Yes.
Secretary, today we saw military planes both in New York and in Washington. How much more of a military presence will we see now that this incident has occurred for the next week?
Those kinds of decisions are made day to day. It is correct that we had aircraft flying protective missions at various places in the United States today, and they will do that as appropriate.
Mr. Secretary, what do you say to the American people who may have questions on how something so coordinated has been...
We're listening to the U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld taking questions at the Pentagon.
...that our intelligence and our security are what they should.
I say to them that the President of the United States will be making some remarks to them this evening that will address those subjects.
Mr. Secretary, you've declared, the Pentagon has declared THREATCON Delta forces around the world. Could you tell me why? Have you received any threats, or has anyone claimed credit for this?
We have, in fact, declared Force Protection Condition Delta and a condition of high alert, indeed the highest alert. We did so almost immediately upon the attacks, and it is still in force.
Mr. Secretary, were there threats issued against other U.S. facilities elsewhere in the world today?
I don't know that there's a day that's gone by since I've been in this job that there haven't been threats somewhere in the world to some facility somewhere. It's one of the complexities of the intelligence business that you have to sort through those kinds of things. But we don't get into the specifics yet. You raise your hand? Yes.
Mr. Secretary, there were rumors earlier in the day that the plane which crashed in Pennsylvania had been brought down by the United States, either shot down or brought down in some other manner.
We have absolutely no information that any U.S. aircraft shot down any other aircraft today.
I wonder if we could just ask Senator Levin one thing. You bet. That's all right. Senator Levin, you and other Democrats in Congress have voiced fears that you simply don't have enough money for the large increase in defense.
Senator Levin, Chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, being asked a question now.
Dip into the Social Security funds to pay for it. Does this kind of thing convince you that an emergency exists in this country to increase defense spending, to dip into Social Security if necessary, to pay for defense spending, increase defense spending?
One thing where the committee was unanimous on, among many, many other things, was that we authorized the full request of the president, including the $18 billion. So I would say that Democrats and Republicans have seen the need for the request.
Mr. Secretary, could you describe what steps are being taken, defensive measures beyond force protection, and whether there's been any operational planning for Homeland Defense instituted?
Those aren't the kinds of things that one discusses.
Sir, the perpetrators of the Khobar Towers bombing were never found, the Cole bombing as well. What assurances or what confidence do you have that the perpetrators of this act will be found?
All one can offer by way of assurance is a seriousness of purpose. We're still taking bodies out of this building, so I would say that that's a little premature.
Mr. Secretary, yes. You've talked about, and others at the podium have talked about being ready, the military is ready, as General Shelton said. And we understand the Navy has dispatched 2 carriers, guided missile cruisers and destroyers, and a couple of Marine Corps helicopter amphibious ships such as the Baton, if not the Baton, here into New York. Can you tell us if that's true, and also any other things you can share with us about how the United States military is preparing to take on whatever in the next few days?
We don't make announcements about ship deployments.
Yes. Can you describe the firefighting efforts that are going on right now in that corridor and search and rescue efforts that are beginning?
Can I describe them?
Yeah.
Why don't we let the Secretary of the Army, who was out there with me a few minutes ago and has been talking to the incident commander on the site.
I think it's fair to say at this point that the fire is contained and will shortly, if not already, be sufficiently controlled to allow entry into the building. That entry will be supervised by the FBI, who are in charge of the site. Assisted by the fire departments that are present. We, on the Army side, will support them as they go in the building and search for casualties and bring them out. Then we will support them in dealing with that. That's what's going on in the ground. We'll take one last.
And we were listening there to a news conference from the U.S. Defense Department, the Pentagon. A news conference that was addressed by the American Defense Secretary, Donald Rumsfeld. He said that the Pentagon was still functioning and would be open on Wednesday. On the issue of casualties in the attacks, he said it was impossible to have solid figures at this stage. He also said that the United States was in no way connected to the explosions that have been occurring at the Afghan capital, Kabul. And within the past few minutes, President Bush has arrived back at the White House. You're listening to the BBC World Service. This is the BBC World Service. We've changed our scheduled programs to bring you uninterrupted coverage of events in the United States. We'll bring you reports from correspondents on the East Coast as well as around the world, with regular news on the latest situation in New York and Washington, D.C. You can also hear our radio reports and find other background information on the internet. That's at www.bbc.co.uk/World Service. You're listening to the BBC in London, bringing you news reports from around the world. For the next hour, Julian and I will be bringing you the latest on this unprecedented situation in the United States. This coverage replaces our normal programming and will continue while events in the US continue to unfold. This is a BBC News special with Fergus Nichol and Julian Marshall. BBC World Service at 23 hours GMT. This is a BBC News special with Julian Marshall and Fergus Nichol. In an unprecedented assault on key symbols of American financial and military power, 3 hijacked planes have been deliberately crashed into New York's World Trade Center and the Pentagon in Washington. There's been tremendous loss of life after the Twin Towers of the center caught fire and later collapsed.
We heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people were jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess, because they're trying to see themselves. I don't know.
There have been expressions of condemnation from around the world. President Bush has said those responsible will be hunted down and punished.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended.
Live reports and analysis of those horrific events coming up, but first we have a bulletin of world news.
BBC News with Doug Jimmerson. There have been a series of catastrophic attacks on the heart of American power in New York and Washington. During the morning rush hour, 2 hijacked passenger jets were flown directly into the 2 towers of the World Trade Center in New York, one of the world's tallest buildings and symbol of American capitalism. Shortly afterwards, another hijacked airliner was flown into the Pentagon building in Washington, the headquarters of the American military. In New York, both towers of the World Trade Center collapsed, one after another, within 2 hours of the impact. The BBC's industrial correspondent Stephen Evans, who was in the towers when it was hit, was giving an interview when the second tower collapsed.
People were just standing around, talking to each other, nodding their heads. Oh my God. We gotta go. Right, well, we're going down. It's going down. Don't worry, it's going down. Okay, so here.
One of the buildings next to the devastated Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, the 47-story Salomon Brothers skyscraper, has now collapsed after catching fire. Earlier, the mayor of New York, Rudolph Giuliani, had ordered an evacuation of Lower Manhattan, where the building stood. But large numbers of rescue workers are in the area, their jobs being hindered by a thick fog of ash, fumes and debris from the ruins. Mr. Giuliani said around 600 people had been admitted to some of New York's many hospitals so far, but the full scale of the tragedy may not be known for several days.
The number of casualties will be more than any of us can bear, ultimately. And I don't think we want to speculate on the number of casualties. The effort now has to be to save as many people as possible.
A third hijacked airliner was deliberately crashed into the Pentagon in Washington. The building burst into flames and part of its 5-sided structure collapsed and continues to burn. Johnny Diamond described what happened there.
Washington has gone from gridlock to desertion. Streets leading down to the administrative center of the city are blocked off by police. Restaurants, office buildings and post offices are shut, and the few people who are on the streets are milling around discussing the events in the nation's capital and in New York. Here on the roof of one of the federal government buildings, I can see smoke still billowing from the Pentagon. The area in front of the White House, normally thick with tourists, is completely empty, except for the vehicles of the police and security forces. The rest of the city is very quiet, the calm punctuated only by the sirens of emergency vehicles.
A fourth airliner crashed outside Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. It's already known that some 260 people were on board the 4 lost airliners, and there are no known survivors. You're listening to the news from the BBC in London. President Bush has consulted his national security advisors about America's response. Mr. Bush has now returned to Washington and is soon to make a national address. Mr. Bush was in Florida at the time of the World Trade Center attack and has since visited 2 Air Force bases, including the Strategic Nuclear Strike Force headquarters in Nebraska. He had this warning for the perpetrators.
Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts. I've been in regular contact with the Vice President, Secretary of Defense, the National Security Team, and my cabinet. We have taken all appropriate security precautions to protect the American people. Our military at home and around the world is on high alert status.
Both President Bush and the Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon have said those who carried out terrorist attacks will have nowhere to hide. Suspicion for the attacks has fallen on Islamic militant groups, including those associated with the Saudi exile Osama bin Laden, who's already wanted by America for alleged involvement in previous attacks on American targets. But the Taliban authorities in Afghanistan, where Mr. bin Laden is based, said he didn't have the capability for such a huge operation. In Palestinian camps in the West Bank, Gaza and Lebanon, some people expressed joy at the attacks. Multiple explosions have rocked the capital of Afghanistan, Kabul. A big fire broke out on the edge of the city, with flames lighting the night sky. It's believed this was caused by a strike on an ammunition dump. Correspondents in Kabul saw missiles flying across the skyline and followed by big blasts. There was anti-aircraft retaliatory fire. United States officials say they don't believe these are American attacks, but they could be caused by the opposition Northern Alliance, which is fighting against the Taliban authorities. Speaking at a news conference at the Pentagon in Washington, the American Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld said the United States was in no way connected to the explosions that have been occurring in the Afghan capital, Kabul. And many governments around the world have followed Washington's example by putting their defense forces on alert and calling emergency security meetings. BBC News.
6 minutes past the hour. This is a BBC News special with Fergus Nichol and Julian Marshall. Panic on the streets of New York shortly after the start of the working day on Tuesday in what was to be the beginning of an horrific sequence of destruction. First one and then a second hijacked airliner were deliberately crashed into the twin towers of the World Trade Center, causing them to catch fire and later collapse. The second plane hitting the World Trade Center as people reacted to the first impact. Soon after, the U.S. Defense Department, the Pentagon near Washington, was also hit by a hijacked plane, while a fourth plane crashed near Pittsburgh. About 50,000 people work at the World Trade Center, which also has thousands of visitors each day. These eyewitnesses described what they saw.
We heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess, because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know. And then I heard that another plane hit, and if you go over by there, you can see the people jumping out the window. They're jumping out the window right now. Oh, my God.
We're standing in front of the Soho Grand Hotel, and the doorman, I went to fire alarm company, the doorman goes to me, wow, I never seen a plane flying so low. And we looked out at it, all of a sudden, boom, it seemed like it wasn't even real. And we came running over here closer to the place, and all of a sudden we saw the other explosion.
A big explosion happened, some guy came out, his skin was all off, I helped him out, this is him all over. There's people jumping out of windows, I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows.
I was just standing here watching the World Trade Center after the first plane hit. I just saw a second plane come in from the south and hit the south tower halfway between the bottom and the top of the tower. It's got to be a terrorist attack. I can't tell you anything more than that. I saw the plane hit the building.
Very upsetting to watch, the whole thing come tumbling down. So we all thought it was another explosion, and we looked up, instead of being two, there's one. And a big plume of smoke.
I was thrown to a window, so I was very lucky to get out. There's a lot of people that didn't get out. There's a lot of people coming down the stairs, burnt up. It was bad. It hit in one World Trade Center, it hit somewhere on the 67th floor. I was on the 56th.
The World Trade Center is one of the tallest buildings of the world and the key symbol of U.S. financial power, as the Pentagon is a symbol of America's military might. A BBC correspondent, Stephen Evans, was in the building at the time. This was his account shortly afterwards.
I was in the base of the building in the foyer when there was one huge thump. It sounded like a full skip of garbage being dropped from a great height. I thought no more of it, but the building did physically shake. A few seconds after that, there were two more big crashes, and people started screaming around me and running, just screaming, "Get out, get out." We are now outside the building, a crowd of people looking up, and if you look up, you see the top, 10 floors of the building, flames actually coming out of those floors, grey smoke billowing across a very clear sky here in Manhattan.
Steve Evans of the BBC in the heart of the developments in New York City. Within the past few minutes in Washington, there's been an extensive briefing at the Pentagon, which, as we've been hearing, was also hit by a hijacked airliner earlier in the day. The briefing was addressed by a variety of top brass from the U.S. military and senior political figures, including the Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, who said that numbers of casualties were impossible to determine just yet. Our correspondent Johnny Diamond has been listening into that briefing. Johnny, what was the mood there from Donald Rumsfeld's point of view?
This was very much how I think the briefing suggested business was going to continue, if not as usual, then the U.S. government, and in particular the Department of Defense, was still functioning. He said, the Pentagon is still functioning, we will be in business tomorrow. There was also, I think, in the lineup of people at this press conference, a message being sent. We had Donald Rumsfeld, we had General Shelby, very senior general, we had the current head of the Senate Armed Services Committee, obviously a Democrat, and the past head of the Armed Services Committee, a Republican. This was a message saying that America and American politicians and its generals are lining up behind President Bush, who will speak to the nation in a couple of hours' time. President Bush has just this moment flown in. I watched this fleet of 5 helicopters land around the White House grounds. Not normally 5 helicopters, normally just the 1 or the 2 helicopters, but clearly extra security precautions tonight here in Washington as President Bush prepares for the most important speech of his life.
And we saw that earlier in the day, President Bush was visiting at least 2 extremely important Air Force bases, presumably to determine for himself the state of military readiness. Tell us, Johnny, Mr. Rumsfeld's press conference addressed also this issue of what appeared to have been attacks on the Afghan capital, Kabul. What was his position on those reported missile strikes?
He batted those away completely. He said in no way is the U.S. government connected to these missile strikes. He was asked also directly whether or not he believed that Osama bin Laden, who had been named as responsible for previous terrorist attacks on the United States, was responsible for these current attacks. He said now is not the time to be specific. He was asked if there was any inkling of the attacks might happen. We don't discuss intelligence, came a very terse reply. And he said, would there be a military response? He was asked, and he said, that is for the president to say. So whilst it was very much a press conference to display the unity both the Defense Department and behind the country's administration, it wasn't one which gave an enormous amount of information out, certainly not about casualty figures either, which at this stage simply aren't known either here in Washington or over in New York.
Johnny Diamond, many thanks. Johnny Diamond reporting from Washington.
Well, let's go now to New York and our correspondent there, Greg Barrow. Greg, 8-9 hours now since those murderous attacks on the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. What's the situation?
Well, the situation now, Julian, is that much of the southern tip of Manhattan is still sealed off as rescue workers continue their efforts to try to find anybody who could possibly have survived this incredible disaster. And the rest of the city is like a ghost town. I mean, it's quite extraordinary out there at the moment. Night is just falling, and on streets that are normally crowded with tourists and evening revelers going about their business, going to restaurants, going to shows, there's very few people around. And I think that is a sign of just how frightened people are, but also how shocked they are. I think the thing that everybody wanted to do after the events today was to go home to their families and be there and be quiet and reflect on what's happened.
Now, how visible is the destruction caused by those 2 hijacked airliners?
Well, quite simply, one of the signatures of the world-famous Manhattan skyline has disappeared. It disappeared in the space of about an hour and a half earlier in the day, shortly after the impact of these 2 aircraft as they flew into the building, caused an explosion, rocked the structure of the buildings, and then we saw those buildings collapse. So one of the main features of that famous Manhattan skyline has now gone and may never return. And that is what everybody will wake up to tomorrow morning when they start trying to travel into Manhattan, particularly those people from New Jersey. When they look at that familiar skyline, it will look very, very different.
The mayor of New York, Rudolph Giuliani, has spoken about a tremendous loss of life. Are we any closer to quantifying what that is?
We're not really. We can only speculate. We know that at least 200 to 300 people died in the 4 aircraft that crashed today, the 2 that crashed into the World Trade Center, the 1 that landed on the Pentagon, and the other that crashed in Pennsylvania. What we also know is that when it is full to capacity, the World Trade Center, 110 stories of office buildings and brokers and stock exchange, that can accommodate 50,000 people. On top of that, you can get hundreds of tourists who are visiting the World Trade Center to see it. It's a world-renowned site, and it gives some of the most incredible views over the city. So that is the greatest potential number of people who could have been caught up in that. Now, what we saw earlier today, shortly after those two planes impacted, they sort of impacted into the top half of the building, so it would have been very difficult for people on those upper floors to get down. But we know that the rescue workers were trying to get people out of the lower parts of the building, and they had about an hour to get them out before the buildings collapsed. Now, how quickly they managed to accomplish that operation and how far it was down the line remains to be seen. That's what we don't know at the moment. We don't know how many people were still trapped inside that building when it collapsed.
Greg, many thanks. That was our correspondent, Greg Barrows, speaking live from New York. It's 23:15 GMT. You're listening to a BBC News special on the attack on the World Trade Center in New York and the American Defense Headquarters outside Washington, the Pentagon. We're expecting a message to the nation from President Bush in the next couple of hours. Meanwhile, let's recap on the traumatic and tragic events of the last few hours. The attack on the United States began as our colleague Alex Brody was on air presenting a BBC World Service news programme.
It looked at first like a terrible accident, a plane crashing into New York's tallest skyscraper. Then cameras trained on the smoking tower picked up another plane, banking and lining up to crash into the second 110-story tower. Two planes, a tower each, within minutes of each other. The BBC's correspondent Steve Evans was in the World Trade Center.
I was in the base of the building, in the foyer, when there was one huge thump. It sounded like a full skip of garbage being dropped from a great height. I thought no more of it, but the building did physically shake. A few seconds after that, there were two more big crashes, and people started screaming around me and running, just screaming, "Get out, get out."
Witnesses could hardly believe what they were seeing.
I saw the first explosion at about 8:30, which I thought was a building being demolished. Behind me, I was standing down on Battery Park, and you just saw sort of clouds of smoke coming up, and nobody was bothered at all. You know, we just thought it was building work going on in New York. And then suddenly you just saw flames coming out of the first tower, and then probably about 20 minutes later, this plane just flew so low across our head and smashed into it looked like it was heading directly for the other tower, and smashed into the tower, just burst into flames. It was just something out of a horror movie.
I had a perfect view, and the plane was coming in. I noticed it a second before it hit the building. It looked like it was moving slowly, and it lined itself up to hit the building directly.
A big explosion happened. Some guy came out. His skin was all off. I helped him out. This is him all over. There's people jumping out of windows. You've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
The financial heart of America was under attack, with the upper stories of the two towers burning. Both eventually collapsed in vast clouds of smoke and dust, collapsed into Manhattan. The political heart of the United States was also attacked. A third hijacked airliner was crashed into the Pentagon, the Defense Department in Washington. Part of it also collapsed. How did the hijackers force the pilots to crash their planes the way they wanted? Or were the hijackers themselves pilots? Who in the world could possibly put this coordinated attack together? A question clearly on the mind of the President of the United States, who was swiftly on the air.
Today we've had a national tragedy. Two airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
It was bad, unbelievably bad, but it got worse. And the next time President Bush spoke, he did not need to refer to an apparent terrorist attack.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
President Bush. In New York, they daren't start to think about how many people may be dead. Put it this way, there have been 4 passenger airliner crashes, 2 in New York, 1 in Washington, and 1 in Pittsburgh. The number of dead in those plane crashes will doubtless be exceeded by the number of casualties at the World Trade Center. Who did it, and why? Michael Clark, head of the Department of Defense Studies at King's College London, on the motive.
Whether the motive is simply revenge or to hurt America, or whether the motive is to generate an astonishing American reaction and some form of American retaliation. And this is not just a terrorist attack, this is the beginning of a crisis.
A senior American senator called this the second Pearl Harbor. Another voice amid the pandemonium said, "This will change everything."
Alex Brady reporting. We cross over now live to the White House, where the U.S. Attorney General John Ashcroft has been giving a news conference. He's now been replaced by somebody else on the podium.
And every one of us at this time expresses our deepest sympathy to the victims of today's tragedies and their families. It is now our mission to begin the healing from this tragedy. From the moment that we learned of these attacks, the Department of Health and Human Services has begun readying teams and resources to be sent to New York City and the Washington area to meet any needs of state and local officials. So far, we have sent 4 disaster medical teams to New York City and 3 of these disaster medical teams to the Washington, Northern Virginia, Baltimore area. These medical teams each consist of about 35 physicians, nurses, and emergency medical technicians. They are all trained to deal with traumatic injuries and other emergency needs. We've also sent 4 disaster mortuary operational response teams to New York and 3 to the greater Washington area. We're also in the process of shipping a great deal of emergency medical supplies to New York City with the help of the Centers for Disease Control. In short, we're making the full force of the Department of Health and Human Services, both its resources and medical expertise available to the areas that need our assistance. We've also this afternoon activated the United States Public Health Service Commission Corps, which consists of approximately 6,000 health professionals. We also are giving backup assistance to the 500-bed ship Comfort from the United States Navy. Americans all over are calling up and asking what they can do. The best thing they can do is respond to this great call by volunteering to give blood. We need Americans to continue to answer that call. No matter where you live, please do your civic duty and assist us by donating blood. As our primary job is to make sure Americans harmed by this tragedy get the help that they need. We will remain in constant contact with the governors, the mayors, public health officials, and other local officials to make sure that all their needs are being met. It is a sad day, but America and all of its citizens certainly share tonight in the grief that has been caused. And as the President and everybody in his administration have said, we, the government, will continue to operate and continue to provide the services to all Americans.
Underlining that the White House is beginning to...
And we were listening there to Tommy Thompson, the U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services, speaking live from the White House on the relief effort for the victims of the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon.
Well, one of the things Secretary Thompson said just there, Americans are calling up and asking what they can do. one of the places Americans call up and do a lot of talking is on talk show radio across the nation. One of the United States' leading phone-in radio stations, Talk America, has been taking calls continuously since that 9 a.m. crisis began in New York City. The president of Talk America joins us now, Mr. Paul Lyle. Welcome to the program. Thanks for speaking with us.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Give us a sense, if you would, Mr. Lyle, of the mood of your contributors.
Well, of course, initially the shock and the horror of watching two great monuments to American capitalism and our way of life utterly destroyed before people's very eyes, live on television. Those of us that were aware of the first crash had the opportunity to see this take place. The second plane driven straight into the World Trade Center, the heart of Manhattan's financial district. And then hearing of the attack on the Pentagon and the confusion with the reports, of course, that many more planes perhaps had been hijacked, that there were other targets in this country. Once the shock settled in, then the anger started coming out, and you could hear that in the voices of our callers. Everyone wants blood, they want revenge. But again, Americans are very cautious before we proceed. Before we can extract any revenge against anyone, we have to identify the perpetrators, and right now we just don't know who did this.
Have people that you've been hearing from on your station and others been speculating from their own perspective who might be responsible for this, or are they sharing your own rather cautious stand-back approach? Let's wait and analyze.
Well, callers to American Talk Radio are somewhat more direct, and they leave caution in the wind. No, they're naming Osama bin Laden, they're naming Muammar Gaddafi, they're naming Saddam Hussein, they're expressing anger at the father and former president of our current president for not completing the job during the Desert Storm action and going in and taking out Saddam Hussein, saying that gave terrorists around the world carte blanche, saying that Americans had no resolve. I don't think we'll make that mistake again.
And does that mean that Joe Public out there wants to see a swift military response from the Pentagon, that's itself being his, of course?
They do. They want to see a swift military response, and they want to see a sizable military response.
Is it too crass and generic a statement to say that people who use talk shows stations such as your own are more conservative? Is that the truth? Are they more likely to be Republican and proactively want to get in with a retaliatory strike?
I think that's quite an understatement. Yes, talk show audiences in this country, and particularly those who call politically based talk shows, are, for the most part, probably 80% conservative, and not just moderately conservative, extremely conservative. And yes, they want the borders closed, they want immigrants kicked out, they want anyone whose skin color may be somewhat different or whose accent isn't the same as theirs. They want these people targeted, and they want them taken out.
And there's got to be some very real concern, briefly, if you would, Mr. Lyle, about the practical effects of potential food shortages caused by difficulties within New York City, flights cancelled, mail deliveries in trouble.
We have extraordinary resources in this country, and while for the next 24 to 48 hours there may be some difficulty in transporting mail and food supplies, I believe that between the trucking industry, the airlines once they get flying again, and of course our train system, the rail system, we will be able to supply these areas. The one thing we are very suspect of right now is the fact that there may be some follow-up attacks in the area of biological weaponry.
All right, Mr. Lyle, President of Talk America, very grateful to you for your time. Thanks for speaking to us here on this BBC News special on the World Service from London.
This is the BBC in London. I'm Julian Marshall with Fergus Nichol. This is a special news programme in the BBC World Service. There's been an extraordinary series of violent attacks on the symbols of United States power in both Washington and New York. 2 passenger airlines were hijacked and deliberately crashed into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York. Both buildings collapsed. A third plane was then flown into the Pentagon Defense Headquarters in Washington. There's clearly been enormous loss of life and many people have been injured. We're breaking our normal schedules to bring you the latest information from the United States following those attacks. We'll be running programs through the next couple of hours with updates from our correspondents around the world. We'll have regular updates about the effects of the attack during this time, with full news bulletins on the top and the bottom of every hour. You're listening to a BBC World Service news special. BBC World Service is The World Today with Fergus Nichol and Julian Marshall. The United States is reeling from 2 terrorist attacks on New York's World Trade Center and the Pentagon outside Washington. There was catastrophic destruction and massive loss of life as both towers of the World Trade Center collapsed. They, like the Pentagon, have been deliberately hit by hijacked commercial airlines. First, though, we have a news summary with Doug Jimison.
There's been a series of catastrophic attacks on the heart of American power in New York and Washington. 2 hijacked passenger jets were flown directly into the twin skyscraper towers of the World Trade Center in New York during morning rush hour. The towers caught fire and collapsed. Shortly afterwards, another hijacked airliner was flown into the Pentagon building in Washington, the headquarters of the American military. The building burst into flames and part of its 5-sided structure collapsed and continues to burn. Another building near the World Trade Center, the 47-story Solomon Brothers building, has also since